Mr. Gavin Gibson, the Executive Vice President, International Pulse Trades and Industries Confederation. Sir, as we know, and I'm not skipping over Ms. Valentine on purpose, I'm not ignoring her, but she will kind of listen to all that's going on, and from the perspective of the WTO, she will comment on each. Mr. Gibson, as we know, the supply chain needs to be flexible enough to respond to sudden changes in the security and supply situation, for example, extreme or volatile weather conditions as a consequence of climate change, whatever, or various market conditions. From your experience, from your perspective, what can we do to manage the commodity supply chain to effectively respond to these unforeseen conditions, which, as we all know, are frequently encountered in the agriculture sector? Sir.
Thank you, Dalton. And thank you, everybody, for allowing me the opportunity to be here this morning. By the way, can you hear me up the back of the room there? Yes? I asked that question actually at a meeting of farmers in Australia a few weeks ago, and a big burly farmer at the back of the room put his hand up and said, "Yes, I can hear you, and I'll gladly change places with anybody who can't." My interest for this meeting is pulses: peas, beans, lentils, chickpeas, and their role in global nutrition. In the sessions yesterday and over conversations after that, there was quite a lot of discussion about the manipulation of currency, the manipulation of commodity markets for profit. And sadly, I think that that's one of those volatilities which the trade in itself can't really do very, very much to handle. It can certainly put pressure on governments, put pressure one way or another for greater regulation, and I really agree that we need to be looking at better regulation, better oversight of the financial markets if we want to take that volatility out of the equation. But when supply is impacted by drought or some of the other extraordinary events that can happen, it's the poor farmers and the poor consumers who are most affected by that. For these groups, achieving food and nutrition security is an uphill challenge at the best of times. And to put this in perspective, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization recently put out some figures that show that despite record GDP growth over the last few years in India, still more than half the Indian population is subsisting on less than half of what would be considered appropriate for normal human consumption. On the other hand, in the relatively affluent developed countries, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and obesity are huge problems, as is the wastage of food. The World Health Organization estimates that up to 80% of heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes, and over a third of cancers, could be prevented by eliminating shared risk factors, particularly unhealthy diets. A diet including pulses has been shown to assist in the control and combating of all these diseases. The irony here is that in these well-fed societies, pulses don't play an important part in customary diets. The fact is that in the subcontinent and in most developing countries, pulses do play a fundamental role as a low-fat, high-fibre source of protein, an essential basic component of traditional food baskets. India is the biggest global consumer of pulses, eating about 20 million tonnes a year, but its domestic production falls somewhere between 3 and 4 million tonnes a year short of the requirement, before we take into account the underconsumption by half their population. A further irony in this picture is that the biggest producers of pulses for export to meet that shortfall are Canada and Australia, countries in which pulses don't play a major role in diet, but where they're grown as part of a sustainable farming rotation. So what happens is that much of the applied research into plant breeding and management for these crops is being carried out in Western countries in order to develop varieties that are higher yielding and disease and drought resistant, but to suit their own climatic and agronomic conditions. Whereas in many developing countries, their gap in domestic production could be fulfilled or partly fulfilled just by improving, not just by improving trade impulses, but also by research to improve their domestic pulse yields, agronomic management, and more importantly, in some cases, their logistics infrastructure. And this would create new income opportunities for farmers and improve their domestic supply. So we have a conundrum on our hands. It's clear that pulses are a positive and important part of a sustainable, healthy diet for both the poor and the rich of the world. Well, this is my view. If we take a positive stand, these are two fantastic opportunities for global trade. If we're clever about it, we can better feed those who don't have enough to eat, and we can improve the health of those who do have, in fact, who have too much. But in practical terms, we need a global focus on research that will allow us to produce and distribute sufficient food crops at affordable prices, regardless of climate volatility, while maintaining adequate return to everyone in the value chain. And that's pretty important. The value chain comprises many people, from the farmer to the consumer, and unless each of those contributors is adequately rewarded for their services, then the trade itself is going to fall apart. As I said before, there are issues such as regulation and control of the finance industry that are to a large degree outside the possibility of direct control and influence by, in inverted commas, the trade. But there are other things a united, cohesive global industry can achieve. And I suppose the reason that I'm here today is that I think that my organisation, CISL-ZIPDIC, is potentially a good model for this. CISL's is the not-for-profit peak industry body for the global pulse industry. It's a confederation. That means it encompasses 15 national peak bodies in all major producing and consuming nations, and in cooperation with them represents the common good of every sector of the global pulse industry, from growers through input suppliers, researchers, accumulators, processors, exporters, importers, distributors, right through to the consumer. We now have over 800 individual corporate members from 55 countries, plus associate membership open to support industries such as banks, shipping companies, machinery manufacturers, and so on. One way or another, CISL's is representative of almost every participant in the global pulse chain. We have a voluntary board of 30 members, which is elected democratically from across both industry sectors and geographic area. We work not only with industry in areas such as contract integrity, transparency of price disclosure, but also with key government authorities to advise on policy, promote the sharing of research outcomes between countries, work towards harmonisation of global quality standards and nomenclature, and reduce duplication of effort and expense. And you know, there's a really good example of that in the way in which, for example, Australia and Canada share research funding and research outcomes, and work together for the benefit of the whole pulse industry. I believe we can use the power that comes from a cohesive body to influence research being carried out in member countries to make it relevant to the issues we've identified. And so, for example, within CISL's, we have a major project underway which is gathering funds from several countries to promote the health and nutritional benefits of pulses in Western diets, while at the same time we're influencing producing nations to concentrate research expenditure on increasing the area planted, increasing the net yield, and improving crop management to reduce the ultimate cost of basic nutrition to poorer consumers. It's worth noting that globally there are huge and unnecessary losses of yield because of things like poor storage, bad transport infrastructure, and so on. Of the 60 to 65 million tonnes of pulses grown annually, around 8 or 9 million tonnes come from Canada and Australia. Estimates of yield loss just from grain missed at harvest or lost because of outdated or inappropriate handling and processing systems in these two countries, which are developed countries, let alone the underdeveloped countries, that loss can be as high as 10 or 15%. And that's in a good season. That equates to around 1 million tonnes a year, which if it returned to the system could make a substantial impact on price. It's this sort of issue that we in the trade can and are working on to influence governments and industry alike to focus research appropriately. And there are many other examples of that. I could go on for ages about it. CISLS, in partnership with its 15 national association members and corporate members in 55 countries from all over the world, is seeking to have 2016 declared the International Year of Pulses. If we're successful, an international year will provide an unprecedented opportunity to raise awareness and to celebrate the role of pulses in feeding the world. Even more importantly, it can become a galvanising moment to draw together key global actors to meet future global food needs and further the contributions pulses make to health, nutrition and sustainability. It will create a unique opportunity to further encourage connections and facilitate movement throughout the food chain that will better utilise pulse-based proteins. It will further global production of pulses by encouraging greater and more focused research and development expenditure in both developed and emerging producing nations. And it will improve crop rotations, increasing yield and quality, and address the challenges of the pulses trade in meeting global demands for food security. We hope that you'll support our initiative and join in our effort to have 2016 declared the International Year of Pulses.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. One quick follow-up, and limit your answer to 2 minutes or so, if I could, sir. Something you said, what is the proper role for private-public collaboration, government role, in managing the effects of existing conditions or sudden changes in supply and demand?
Dalton, I can only talk from the pulse industry's point of view, so forgive me if I sound a little parochial about this. I think there's a fundamental before we even talk about what we're going to do, and that fundamental is to make sure that you are bringing the whole of the industry side of any particular traded commodity together so that everybody understands what the problem is and has sufficient background understanding of how something that emerges suddenly may impact on the industry. And in an organisation like ours, that's what we do. We have, let me try and think of a good example of this. In 2009 in Australia, we had catastrophic rainfall events in a large number of the growing areas. And what looked like was going to be a record crop of perhaps close to 1 million tonnes of chickpeas turned into a disastrous crop of poor quality chickpeas of about 300,000 tonnes. We were able to mobilise the industry in Australia to put different segregations of those crops together and salvage as much of them as we could. Now, we didn't solve the whole problem, but because we had a cohesive industry and because there was understanding through the industry of how this was likely to impact on their supply, we certainly managed to minimise the impact of the situation.
All right. Mr. Gibson, thank you very much.